For decades, many African nations were required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France. Not as cash, but in gold. Half of what these countries earned each year went straight into French vaults, leaving only the rest to fund national development, pay salaries, and keep governments running. But it doesn't stop there. Many African countries were also forced to store their gold reserves in the United States, specifically at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Why? Because, after sinking deep into debt with the IMF and the World Bank, they had to use that gold as collateral. And here's the kicker, much of that gold has never made its way home, at least not until now. In a bold and unprecedented move, Ibrahim Traore, the young and revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, is turning the tide. He's leading the charge to repatriate Africa's gold and foreign reserves. And he's not alone. Other nations are beginning to follow his lead, pushing back against a system many now call a modern form of economic colonialism. So, how is this actually happening? Who else is stepping up? And how are Western powers responding to this seismic shift? Let's unpack it. For generations, France has kept an iron grip on its former colonies through a financial system known as the CFA France, a monetary structure that, on paper, looks cooperative but in reality, keeps African nations economically tethered to Paris. The CFA franc, which stands for Communauté Financière Africaine, or African Financial Community, is a currency that 14 African countries are forced to use, split between two blocks. The first is the West African Economic and Monetary Union, or WEMU. It includes Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. And while these countries technically have their own central banks, in reality, they don't control their own money. France still oversees their monetary policy, dictates their currency exchange rates, and profits from the interest earned on the reserves these African nations are forced to deposit in French treasury accounts. Think about that. Nations that gained independence on paper decades ago are still financially handcuffed by a former colonial power. And this isn't just about economics, it's about sovereignty, dignity, and the right to decide your own destiny. That's why Ibrahim Traore's move is so significant. He's not just talking about change, he's demanding it. Now, other countries like Mali and Niger are reportedly joining the movement, pushing to withdraw from the CFA system, reclaim their gold, and take back control of their national wealth. So, how is the West reacting so far? With visible discomfort and subtle resistance. Because if African nations reclaim their reserves, reject exploitative currency systems, and forge new alliances, some even looking toward Russia and China, it threatens to disrupt decades of Western economic dominance on the continent. The question now isn't whether change is coming, it's how fast, and who's brave enough to lead it. Stay tuned because this story isn't just about gold, it's about power, it's about freedom, and it's about the beginning of a new chapter in African history. Imagine this, you're a nation rich in gold. Your people are working the land, extracting one of the most valuable resources on earth. But instead of that gold staying in your country to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, it's shipped off to Paris, locked away in vaults you don't control. That's exactly what has been happening for decades under the CFA franc system, a deeply controversial financial arrangement between France and 14 of its former African colonies. Under this system, African nations were forced to deposit at least 50% of their foreign currency reserves into the French treasury, not just in cash but often in gold. And yes, that gold was physically stored in France, not in the countries it came from. In practical terms, while African workers generated wealth through labor, agriculture, and mining, half of that national income was quietly funneled into France's economy, not their own. It was economic brilliance for France, and a disaster for Africa. This setup didn't just limit how these nations managed their finances, it kept them in a permanent state of dependency. And the real exploitation? It happened through France's grip on African gold reserves. Take countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire, some of the top gold producers in the world. But you wouldn't know it from their living standards. Why? Because they never had full control over their own gold. From the moment it was mined, large portions were sent directly to France. Here's how the control worked. French mining companies dominated the local industry, extracting massive quantities of gold while paying shockingly low royalties to the governments, sometimes as little as 3 to 5%. That means, before the gold could even be counted as part of national wealth, it was already gone. What wasn't immediately taken by foreign companies was still legally required to be stored in France, a condition for maintaining the stability of the CFA franc currency. That's right, African nations had to ask permission to access or use their own gold. It was like owning a car but needing your neighbor's keys to drive it. On top of that, the CFA franc was pegged to the French franc, and later, the euro at a fixed exchange rate that made exports less competitive and stopped these countries from setting monetary policies that matched their own economic needs. The numbers are staggering. It's estimated that France siphons off around $500 billion every year from Africa through mechanisms tied to the CFA system and resource extraction. $500 billion, leaving the continent every single year, keeping the former colonizer wealthy, while its former colonies remain underdeveloped. Think about the irony. Entire populations working hard to extract resources, only to have their wealth stored on another continent, untouchable, unused, and unreturned. That's not just unfair, it's strategic economic strangulation. But today, the story is beginning to shift. Leaders like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso and others are stepping up to demand the repatriation of reserves and the end of the CFA franc system. We may be witnessing the beginning of a financial revolution in Africa. The big questions now are, how far will these leaders go? Who will join the movement? And how will the West respond when Africa finally demands control over its own wealth? Because one thing is clear, Africa wants its gold back. And this time it's not asking, it's acting. Now, imagine running a country, but you can't touch your own savings. You can't lower your interest rates to grow your economy. You can't even use your gold to back your currency without calling up a foreign government for permission. That's exactly what happened to many African nations under the CFA franc system, a system that kept them economically handcuffed to France. It wasn't just an unfair agreement. It was financial control, plain and simple. France not only dictated their currency value, but also kept their gold reserves locked away, preventing them from using their own wealth to shape independent economic policy. Let's call it what it really was, a form of modern-day financial slavery. This system wasn't just designed to keep Africa poor. It punished those who dared to fight back. One of the most powerful and tragic examples was Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso in the 1982nd. Sankara was unlike most African leaders of his time. He didn't just want independence on paper. He wanted real sovereignty. He stood up and said, "Enough is enough." He demanded the return of Burkina Faso's gold reserves from France. He pushed to nationalize the gold mining industry so that profits stayed in the country and actually benefited the people. And perhaps most boldly, he began working to create a truly independent African currency, one not tied to the French franc or the euro. While most leaders were lining up for loans from the IMF and the World Bank, Sankara refused. He saw those institutions as tools of Western dominance, not development. He believed African nations should never be trapped in cycles of debt dictated by foreign creditors. But that kind of courage came with a cost. On the 15th of October, 1987, just 4 years after taking office, Sankara was assassinated in a military coup. The man who replaced him, Blaise Compaoré, was widely believed to be backed and supported by France. Sankara was just 37 years old when he was murdered. But his legacy still burns strong. He remains a symbol of African resistance against neo-colonial control, and his death became a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to challenge the old order. So when we talk about economic control, foreign influence, or why Africa remains dependent despite its vast wealth, it's not just about numbers. It's about stories like Thomas Sankara's stories of leaders who tried to break free and paid the ultimate price. The real question is, who's next to take up his fight? And this time, will the world finally be ready to listen? As soon as Blaise Compaoré seized power in Burkina Faso, right after the assassination of Thomas Sankara, He didn't waste any time undoing everything Sankara had fought for. Almost overnight, he reversed Sankara's revolutionary policies, welcoming back French influence with open arms. Control over Burkina Faso's gold? Handed right back to Paris. Any push for economic independence? Gone. It was as if Sankara's legacy had been scrubbed clean. But Traoré wasn't the only leader to cave or be forced to. Another figure who stood up to France's financial grip was Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of Côte d'Ivoire. Gbagbo dared to challenge the system too. He wanted his country's gold kept at home, not sitting in vaults in France. His idea was simple. Let's use our own wealth to build our own country. But that didn't sit well with the powers in Paris. In 2011, things escalated. France accused Gbagbo of rigging elections. And then, in a shocking move, French military forces directly intervened in Côte d'Ivoire. Troops surrounded his residence, captured him, and handed him over to the International Criminal Court under highly questionable circumstances. The message was loud and clear. Challenge France's control, and you'll be removed. And it worked. After Gbagbo's fall, France installed a more compliant leader, and the country remained locked into the CFA franc system. For years, this kind of intervention silenced African resistance. Nations relied too heavily on Western loans, military aid, and diplomatic support to push back. But now, the tide is turning. A new wave of revolutionary leaders is stepping forward, and they're not asking for permission. Names like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, and Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger are emerging as a united front. Their message is bold. We're done being controlled. These nations have already expelled French troops, canceled military pacts, and severed ties with their former colonial ruler. But they're not stopping there. They're now demanding the return of their gold reserves, and they're working to create gold-backed financial systems, independent of the CFA franc and outside the reach of France. And other African nations? They're watching closely. Senegal, Chad, Gabon. They're on the edge of their seats, keeping close tabs on how this new movement plays out. If these new leaders succeed, it could trigger a domino effect across the continent. Even global powers are taking notice. Russia and China have stepped in, offering support and alternative alliances through forums like BRICS. They're promoting a global shift away from the US dollar, what they call de-dollarization, and encouraging Africa to build sovereign gold-backed economies. Right now, France is in deep trouble, politically and economically, as its long-standing dominance over Africa begins to collapse. For decades, France maintained its global influence by quietly reaping the rewards of African wealth, gold, oil, and natural resources that fueled its economy. But now, with revolutionary African leaders cutting ties, that gravy train is coming to a halt. And Paris? It's panicking. Without those resources, France's economic engine could stall, and it knows it. That's why it's doing everything in its power to undermine this African uprising, pulling moves straight out of the old colonial playbook. Let's break it down. France has already cut off economic aid to countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, deliberately trying to create a financial crisis. The goal? Force them back into the CFA franc system by pushing them to the brink. But the sabotage doesn't stop there. French-aligned media outlets across Europe and the US are now churning out negative stories about Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and other leaders behind this anti-colonial push, painting them as dictators, anti-democratic, or dangerous. Why? So that when France or its allies step in with sanctions or even military intervention, it'll look justified. It's textbook information warfare. First, discredit the movement, then destroy it. And with France's history of backing coups across Africa, many fear it's only a matter of time before they try again. Burkina Faso, Mali, even Niger could all be targets. But here's the thing. France isn't the only one holding on to Africa's gold. A massive chunk of African wealth is locked up in the United States, sitting in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, you might think African nations willingly stored their gold there for safekeeping. But the truth? That's not even close. These countries were pressured, some would say forced into it. Here's how it works. Whenever an African nation needed funding for schools, roads, or emergency relief, it often had to go through the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Sounds reasonable, right? But there was a catch. These institutions, largely controlled by Western powers, would only offer loans under strict conditions. Conditions that often demanded African nations hand over control of their gold reserves, hike taxes, cut social services, or adopt harsh austerity measures. This system of predatory lending created a trap. Countries needed the money, but taking it meant surrendering their economic freedom. So while African workers mined the gold and built the value, Western banks held the keys, and African nations were left borrowing their own wealth back, with interest. That's the brutal reality. Now that leaders like Traoré and Goïta are waking the continent up to this long-running scam, France and even the US are scrambling to hold on to a system that benefits them at Africa's expense. But make no mistake, the momentum is shifting. All right, let's keep it going, because what you're about to hear next will leave you shaking your head. One of the most brutal conditions slapped onto African nations by the IMF and the World Bank was something called forced currency devaluation. Now, if that sounds like technical finance jargon, here's what it really means. African countries were pushed to make their money worth less on purpose. And overnight, that meant two things. Everything they imported suddenly became more expensive, and everything they exported instantly lost value. That's a 1-2 punch, crippling their economies and making it nearly impossible to compete in the global market. But it didn't stop there. These same financial institutions also demanded that government/public spending to the bone, less money for schools, less money for hospitals, less money for roads, infrastructure, and basic services. Entire generations grew up with limited access to quality education and healthcare, not because of local mismanagement, but because of foreign-imposed austerity. And if that wasn't enough to choke a nation's growth, they added another devastating condition: privatization. Governments were told to sell off state-owned industries companies that were often profitable and vital to national development. But here's the catch. Instead of selling them to local investors or reinvesting in the economy, these assets were often sold off for pennies on the dollar to foreign corporations from Europe and North America. Translation? Africa lost control of its own economic engines, and the profits left the continent just as fast as the gold did. And speaking of gold, perhaps the most outrageous demand of all was this. Many African nations were forced to store their foreign currency reserves, mostly in gold, outside the continent. Often, that meant the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That gold was supposed to act as collateral for loans they had taken. But here's the kicker. Even after some countries paid back their debts, their gold was never returned. Why? Because the legal agreements were crafted in such a way that repayment wasn't the end of the deal. It was the start of a new debt cycle. These contracts were engineered to keep Africa permanently entangled, financially dependent, and powerless to reclaim its own wealth. The IMF and the World Bank gave polite, empty promises about returning the gold once the country stabilized. But in practice, that day never came, and the gold stayed locked away in vaults thousands of miles from home. A treasure that belonged to Africa, but was hoarded by the West. For decades, African nations have been trapped in this brutal financial loop, paying off debts, only to fall right back into the same trap again. Even when a country somehow managed to settle its loans, getting back what was theirs, especially their gold reserves, was like trying to pull teeth from a locked vault. The legal red tape and the bureaucratic blockades put in place by Western financial powers like the IMF and the World Bank made it nearly impossible for African governments to reclaim their own wealth. All right, let's keep it going, because what you're about to hear next will leave you shaking your head. One of the most brutal conditions slapped onto African nations by the IMF and the World Bank was something called forced currency devaluation. Now, if that sounds like dry financial jargon, here's what it really means. African countries were pushed to make their money worth less on purpose. And overnight, that meant two things. Everything they imported suddenly became more expensive, and everything they exported instantly lost value. That's a 1-2 punch, crippling their economies and making it nearly impossible to compete in the global market. But it didn't stop there. These same financial institutions also demanded that governments slash public spending to the bone, less money for schools, less money for hospitals, less money for roads, infrastructure, and basic services. Entire generations grew up with limited access to quality education and healthcare, not because of local mismanagement, but because of foreign-imposed austerity. And if that wasn't enough to choke a nation's growth, they added another devastating condition: privatization. Governments were told to sell off state-owned industries, companies that were often profitable and vital to national development. But here's the catch. Instead of selling them to local investors or reinvesting the money back into the economy, these assets were often sold off for pennies on the dollar to foreign corporations from Europe and North America. Translation: Africa lost control of its own economic engines, and the profits left the continent just as fast as the gold did. And speaking of gold, perhaps the most outrageous demand of all was this. Many African nations were forced to store their foreign currency reserves, mostly in gold, outside the continent. Often, that meant the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That gold was supposed to act as collateral for loans they had taken. But here's the kicker. Even after some countries paid back their debts, their gold was never returned. Why? Because the legal agreements were written in such a way that repayment wasn't the end of the deal, it was the start of a new debt cycle. These contracts were engineered to keep Africa permanently entangled, financially dependent, and powerless to reclaim its own wealth. The IMF and the World Bank gave polite, empty promises about returning the gold once the country stabilized. But in practice, that day never came, and the gold stayed locked away in vaults thousands of miles from home. A treasure that belonged to Africa, but was hoarded by the West. For decades, African nations have been trapped in this brutal financial loop, paying off debts, only to fall right back into the same trap again. Even when a country somehow managed to settle its loans, getting back what was theirs, especially their gold reserves, was like trying to pull teeth from a locked vault. The legal red tape and the bureaucratic blockades put in place by Western financial powers like the IMF and the World Bank made it nearly impossible for African governments to reclaim their own wealth. They ousted pro-French regimes and began aligning their economic visions with Traoré's. The dominoes are falling. For the first time in modern history, multiple African nations are coming together to resist the financial dominance of the West, not with diplomacy alone, but with action. This isn't just a trend, it's a turning point. A moment many are calling the birth of a new Pan-African resistance, one grounded not in rhetoric, but in gold, sovereignty, and ownership. And the West, especially France and the United States, is on high alert. To the casual observer, repatriating gold might sound like a dry, technical move. But in geopolitical terms, it's seismic. For decades, the US and France, backed by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, have used Africa's gold reserves as leverage, dictating economic policy and keeping entire nations in check. But now, as countries like Burkina Faso take back control of their gold, that leverage is disappearing. And with it, the West's ability to impose conditions, enforce austerity, or call the financial shots across the continent. If this movement spreads, and all signs say it will, Western influence in Africa could shrink dramatically. And for the first time in generations, African nations may hold the keys to their own financial futures. But there's an even bigger storm brewing, one that's causing sleepless nights in Washington and on Wall Street: the growing threat to the US dollar's dominance. See, it's not just that African countries are bringing their gold home. That alone would be a major shift. What's happening now is even more groundbreaking. They're starting to ditch the US dollar altogether in trade. Take Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, three of Africa's biggest economies. These nations are actively exploring gold-backed trade systems that would allow them to exchange goods and services without ever touching a dollar. If this continues, we could be looking at a fast-track decline of the US dollar as the world's go-to currency. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. The rise of BRICS, a coalition of emerging powers including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is fueling a global wave of de-dollarization. And guess what? Many of the African countries repatriating their gold, like South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, are either already in BRICS or knocking on the door to join. What does BRICS want? A gold-backed international currency, something that could directly challenge the US dollar and throw global financial power into a whole new balance. For Western powers, this isn't just unsettling. It's a direct threat to decades of economic dominance. But here's where it gets real. History tells us, when Africa tries to break free, the West doesn't exactly clap in approval. Let's not forget Muammar Gaddafi, the former Libyan leader who proposed a single, gold-backed currency for Africa. A currency that would unify the continent financially and free it from Western monetary systems. What happened? In 2011, NATO forces invaded Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. And with him, the dream of an African gold currency died, at least for a while. Fast forward to today. Leaders like Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta in Mali, and Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger are picking up where Gaddafi left off. They're pushing hard for full control over their gold and national reserves. And their actions are challenging everything the West has built over the last century in Africa. That's why retaliation is not just possible, it's likely. Economic sanctions, political coups, propaganda in Western media, even covert or direct military operations. All of it is on the table when the US and France see their influence slipping through their fingers. Because the truth is, this isn't just about economics. It's about control. By demanding their gold back, African nations are reclaiming their power. They're saying, our wealth belongs at home, not in Paris, not in New York, not in foreign vaults we can't even access. This is more than a financial decision. It's a revolution, a once-in-a-generation chance for Africa to finally throw off the shackles of financial colonization and chart its own future. But it won't be easy. The battle for economic freedom is just beginning. And the big question now is, will the West allow Africa to rise? Or will it fight tooth and nail to keep the continent in a financial cage? One thing's for sure, Africa is not waiting anymore. The days of begging for aid, accepting bad loans, and storing gold in foreign vaults are coming to an end. A new era of African economic strength is on the horizon. So what about the rest of the continent? Will they follow Burkina Faso's lead, or stay trapped in the gold chains of the West? We want to hear from you. Should all African nations demand the return of their gold and foreign reserves? Should Africa finally keep its wealth in African hands, not in the vaults of former imperial powers? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the tools of modern colonialism and how Africa can break free from them, one gold bar at a time. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a drop. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay bold, stay informed, and stay tuned.